The only electric tramway currently operating in the Republic of South Africa is a short tourist line in the dam and city of Kimberley. Since 1985, this delightfully restored single-truck car has transported visitors from the town centre to the Open Mine Museum, owned by De Beers Consolidated Mines Limited. Fittingly, Kimberley was the last place in the Republic to run trams, albeit only on internal mine services, these working ceasing about 1964. The last conventional city trams had operated at Johannesburg 3 years earlier in March 1961. The country's other electric tramways, faced by increasing competition from buses and automobiles, had all closed between 1930 and 1949. The majority of the trams were imported from either Britain or the United States. For example, the Kimberley tourist tram is of American origin. Many British operating practices prevailed throughout the former colony, especially the use of double-deckers. The story of South Africa's trams begins in Cape Town. As early as 1863, a line was opened linking the Market Square to Sea Point. The gauge, which continued into the electric era, was an unusual 4 foot 9 inches. Eventually, 3 companies offered a mixed fleet of single and double-deck cars. Cape Town also operated the country's first electric trams, with passenger service starting nearly a century ago on the 6th of August 1896. Although controlled by a London-based company, the first cars were imported from the United States. The single-deckers were of the California type. Later deliveries included vehicles built by the United Electric Car Company of Preston in England. Some of these were long maximum traction bogie cars with the typical South African-style open-sided top decks, protected against heat and rain by canvas blinds. By the 1920s, the system totaled 21 route miles, the last extension opening in 1927. Six handsome brush-built equal-wheel cars were delivered in 1924. Some later received vestibules. Between 1928 and 1931, some older vehicles were given enclosed top decks and balconies, and a few also received vestibules. The final new cars, which had a relatively short life, were built in the company workshops between 1925 and 1931. All were gone by 1936. The next scenes were filmed on the city's last route to Sea Point, shown in yellow, immediately prior to its conversion to trolleybus operation in January 1939. The light blue lines represent the routes already closed, and the green, the independent Camps Bay system. The trams had never recovered financially from fierce motorbus competition in the 1920s. The preponderance of single track, coupled with antiquated rolling stock, hastened their demise. Cars for the 4-mile trip to Sea Point loaded in the city centre. Note the different designs of top deck. '59 dated from 1919. '49, which had spent most of its life shuttling between Sea Point and the city centre, dated from 1913. Tramway operation came to an end on the 28th of January 1939, when the last of the Green and Cream Company cars rolled into Sea Point Depot, the final trip being made by brush bogie 102. The rails were quickly lifted. For several months, Tollgate Depot was a hive of activity as the trams were dismantled. The depot and works lay on one of the routes abandoned earlier. The last running depot at Sea Point never housed trolleybuses and was eventually demolished. The Cape Town Tramways, together with its associate company in Port Elizabeth, never practiced racial segregation on its trams. Sadly, none of the vehicles were set aside for preservation, but some bodies were sold for use as sheds and chicken coops, of which a few reputedly survive in 1995. Sea Point had also been one of the termini of the independent Camps Bay, Cape Town and Sea Point Tramway Company, which operated by way of Kloof Neck. The 6.5-mile line operated through spectacular scenery and included some grades of 1 in 9. The fleet of 14 chocolate brown and cream cars all originated from the electric tramway and carriage works at Preston. Some were of the completely open gridiron pattern. Others were of the partially open or California type favoured in mild climates. From the outset, a freight service was provided. The line was the first to close in South Africa in February 1930. Some 500 miles east of Cape Town lies this busy seaport. These scenes, filmed in the early 70s, recapture the days when steam still dominated much of the country's railway network. Earlier still, the hills bordering the town have been served by a medium-sized standard-gauge tramway. Horse trams had been introduced in 1881, and the system was electrified in early 1897, the cars being operated by the same London-based company as those at Cape Town. The original fleet was all imported from the USA, and consisted of double-deckers and California-style single-deckers, all on Brill trucks. At least a couple of double-deckers were cut down in the 1930s. The next new deliveries were Brill semi-convertibles, but in the 20s all were rebuilt with enclosed saloons. These double-deckers on Brill 22E trucks dated from 1913. Similar vehicles followed in the early 20s. These single-deckers were virtually identical to contemporary cars in Cape Town and may have been built by the local company, the last entering service in 1932. Despite the company's wish to expand and modernize, the system was abandoned between 1938 and 1948. This relatively small city, 150 miles northeast of Port Elizabeth, had electric trams from 1900 to 1935. Throughout its life, the standard gauge system was operated by 15 English-built double-deckers of 3 different types. Eventually, the green and cream cars had completely open top decks, protected only by the usual canvas blinds. The circular drive, one of the most scenic rides in South Africa, was created following an extension across the Blind River in 1923. The system closed on the 23rd of October, 1935. South Africa's premier port developed rapidly at the end of the last century. Horse trams, introduced in 1881, expanded swiftly to serve all parts of the town, the last extension to Stamford Hill opening in 1898. Following electrification in 1902, the initial fleet consisted of 30 double-deckers, 8 from Brill and 22 from GF Milnes, all on Brill 21E trucks. A further 60 single-truck double-deckers followed, some being built by Hearst Nelson. Between 1914 and 1927, 30 high-capacity double-deckers were built by the corporation. This car dated from 1919. Some were later rebuilt with vestibules and enclosed balcony ends. 119 and 120 were totally enclosed. Abandonments in favour of trolleybuses began with the route serving the beach area in 1935. As in Britain, the war led to a temporary suspension of the conversion programme. However, by July 1949, only 2 routes remained, worked by 16 cars. The 2 lines combined to form the Musgrave Road-Marriott Road Circle. Durban's giant trams, the largest in South Africa, were great crowd movers, swallowing up literally scores of pupils from schools along the route. Official seating capacity was 90, with 25 standing, although claims were made that on certain occasions up to 150 squeezed on board. Note the mixture of imported motor cars. The last route shared a fascinating history. They had been converted to buses in 1940, trams being reinstated in 1943. Then in 1949 they were again operated by buses, until trolleybuses took over in 1958. Then finally, a decade later, back once more to buses. A tram setting out along the Marriott Road route transcribed the full circle, but only in the counterclockwise direction. Both routes started in Gardner Street, close to the post office and railway station. Evoking memories of British-style practice, the crew off the cars at the layover point on Marriott Road sport white tops on their caps. By 1949, conductors were issuing Tim-style tickets. The single-track sections on the outer part of the circle were protected by signal lights. Greyville, junction with the former North Ridge Road route, abandoned some months earlier. Power was provided by 4 25-horsepower motors. Travelling towards the city along First Street. The last day of normal service was the 31st of July 1949. 3 types of bogie car remained. This battered veteran still had open platforms as well as a totally exposed top deck, and was probably in as-built condition. Whereas this car has enclosed vestibule and balcony ends. Note the rolled-up canvas blinds. The city's last tram had a heavy cowling above the open platform and may also have been in as-built condition. Arriving in Gardner Street to pick up invited guests for the final commemorative run out to Mitchell Park on Tuesday the 2nd of August 1949. Amongst those on board were civic leaders and former tramway employees. First onto the upper deck was Wilfred White, producer of this historic film. Among the throng of former employees would have been many who would recall Durban's famous funeral tram, which for over 30 years was available for European use only. The non-European population having access to a trailer until 1921. "7015 crosses the Greyville intersection before proceeding along Florida Road. Arriving at Mitchell Park. Here the guests were served afternoon tea. The gentleman who had driven the first electric tram and later became a Lord Mayor of Durban is seen on the left, leaving the Mitchell Park reservation. Having slipped momentarily backwards, the guest driver is swiftly rescued by the hand of experience before running against the traffic flow into Musgrave Road, rolling through suburban Durban for the last time. The excitement over, 7015 slips into Alice Street Depot, virtually unnoticed. In 1949, large high-capacity bogie cars had also eked out their last days in the United Kingdom on such systems as Blackburn, Bury and Manchester. 7015 dated from 1915. And 7004 from 1921. Both had previously carried different numbers. For example, 7004 had started life as 102, before becoming 0102 and finally 7004 in 1945. The majority of the cars were dismantled, although a few were sold by public auction. The redundant rails were literally torn from the ground by gangs of labourers. These scenes on the former Umbrillo Road route. By 1968, the conquering trolleybuses, too, would be gone. A few bits and pieces did find their way into private homes. Sadly, this lower saloon from a four-wheeler gradually disintegrated at Curry's Park. A few saloons were adapted to provide temporary accommodation during a period of severe housing shortage. No complete car has survived. Some 70 miles inland from Durban is the capital of Natal Province, which from 1904 to 1936 had the country's smallest tramway with just 6 route miles. The entire fleet was English built. The first 6 had brush bodies on maximum traction trucks. Initially they sported Bellamy-style top covers with the usual roller blinds. 7 to 16 of 1905 were brush-built single truckers with radial axles and enclosed balcony ends. Later, the original cars received different style top decks. Some 250 miles north of Pietermaritzburg, deep in eastern Transvaal, is the iron ore mining area centred around Pilgrim's Rest. From 1897, the mines were served by a 7-mile electrically operated mineral tramway, which hauled cocoa pans of ore to the central mill at Pilgrim's Rest. The gauge was 2 foot 6 inches. By the late 20s, some of the network had closed, but the track to the mine at Beta remained in industrial use until 1971, when these views were taken. Power was generated from a small hydroelectric plant. One of the tiny passenger trailers. The miniature steeple cabs escaped the scrapman's torch, and at least one has been rescued. Plans exist to reopen part of the line to convey tourists to Pilgrim's Rest, which is now classified as an historic monument. By late 1995, the tramway was not yet operational again. Another all-English built fleet served the nation's capital. Here the standard gauge system, opened as late as 1910, had replaced a network of narrow gauge horse tramways. All the trams emerged from the Preston works of the United Electric Car Company, later English Electric. The first were open-fronted single truckers. In hot weather, the side panels could be removed. Long, equal-wheel bogie cars followed, with deliveries of different batches from 1911 to at least 1920. During the 30s, the trams were phased out, the last car departing from Church Square in August 1939. Situated 70 miles south of Pretoria lies the City of Gold. For many years, British buses were exported to the city. In the 70s, Johannesburg was renowned in transport circles for being the last city in the world to operate predominantly British-built double-decker trolleybuses. It was also the last place in South Africa to retain its city trams. This was largely due to a commission of inquiry which had advocated modernising large sections of the system in 1934. With the discovery of gold, the city developed rapidly. Public transport starting in 1891. Eventually, a large fleet of different types of English-built horse cars was operated. In 1904, the trams came under municipal control. Electrification began in 1906. To all intents and purposes, it was a classic British-style undertaking. The first 100 cars, known as the Springboks, were all Preston-built double-deckers on Brill 21E trucks. 1 to 20 had full-length top covers, but open balconies and open-sided top decks. Glimpsed behind number 15 is one of 20 five-window open toppers, all of which were top-covered by 1912. 41 to 80 were identical to 1 to 20, except for having longitudinal seating in the lower saloon. 81 to 100 of 1907 were five-windowed, top-covered balcony cars. Nine Springboks were cut down to single-deck form in the 1920s, number 15 eventually becoming the city's illuminated tram. 1907 marked arrival of the first 10 bogie cars. Mounted on Brill maximum traction trucks, they were identical to the London United Tramway's T-Class, even to the broken staircases with half landings. Equal wheel trucks were under brush-built numbers 111 to 120 of 1913. This class proved hopelessly underpowered when tackling the city's many hills. When delivered, these cars had enclosed balcony ends. In the far background is one of 15 single truckers dating from 1915, which had brush bodies on Preston-built 21E trucks. Between 1919 and 1930, the JMT rebuilt several works cars into native-only passenger cars. Later, some of the original double-deckers would be transferred to the native or non-European fleet. Between 1919 and 1931, the corporation built 65 high-capacity bogie cars on imported brush underframes. Although divided into 4 subdivisions, they were, on account of their Westinghouse air brakes, known collectively as the air bogies. When built, the first 30 had open vestibules, balconies and upper deck sides. After the Second World War, the upper decks were enclosed and drivers' vestibules added. 170 to 192, built in the early 20s, were dubbed the Bluebirds on account of their new blue and grey livery. The final dozen air bogies entered service in 1930-31 and had brush equal-wheel trucks and more powerful 50-horsepower motors. In 1934, the corporation took delivery of 2 experimental cars, both built by MCW of Birmingham. In appearance and construction, they were similar to cars recently built for Edinburgh. 9 was mounted on an EMB hornless truck. 2, which was more successful, was a 60-seater 4-motor car on EMB heavyweight radial arm bogies. Like 9, it also had front exits, which reduced overall capacity. The tramway owed its survival to the recommendations of the Spencer Commission of 1934, which advocated replacement of loss-making routes, but modernisation of the remaining lines, together with the purchase of new cars. The 50 streamliners, which entered service in July 1936, incorporated the latest technology and were partly modelled on the Leeds Corporation Middleton bogies. They had all metal 76-seater MCW bodies. However, the trucks were split, 25 having EMB heavyweights, and the remainder Maley and Taunton swing-link bogies. Their arrival facilitated transfer of more cars to the non-European fleet. This map shows the tramway system at its maximum extent. Trolleybuses were first introduced in 1936, replacing some tram routes. After the war, the growth in car ownership, which occurred a decade earlier than in Britain, sparked a vociferous anti-tram campaign. This underpass dated from 1937. By 1946, many of the older bogie cars were employed on non-European or native-only duties. Vintage British-built buses. Despite the anti-tram propaganda, loadings rose dramatically, with central area termini being introduced for the non-European routes. An open-fronted air bogie car. These scenes show the air bogies in various stages of transition before all were totally enclosed in the immediate post-war period. Workshop staff were fully occupied, keeping over 220 cars in daily use. Bowing to pressure, the JMT announced in 1948 that the trams would be phased out as capital equipment fell due for renewal. The northern routes K and L were the first to go. A complex system of route letters and numbers had been introduced in 1936. The war had postponed conversion of the long line to Parktown North, which should have been replaced by trolleybuses in the late 30s. Industrial activity on the Melville route. Parktown North, terminus of the L1. These rare, high-quality colour prints date from 1946-7. British-built double-decker trolleybuses dating from 1936 also at Parktown North. A considerable proportion of the Parktown route was on reserved track, and the Ls also served the city zoo. Owing to the appalling state of the track, the H services operating along Boysons Road past the mine dumps to Rosettenville and Turpentine were replaced in September 1957. The routes to Mayfair and Crown Mines, the I's, gave way to trolleybuses in March 1958. The JMT had two 15-road depots. Number 1 depot, seen here, dated from 1906 and housed the bulk of the operational fleet. In 1959, it was also home to the former illuminated tram, which had served during the war as a rail grinder. It was to be scrapped later in the year. Experimental bogie number 2 was still on the roster, but would be withdrawn a few months later. A short distance away was depot number 2, opened in 1926, although it had only been used exclusively by trams since 1938. Here were the last remnants of the classic British-built trams, which had typified operations in Johannesburg for over 50 years. For example, this veteran was one of the 1913 bogie cars, all of which had been transferred to non-European service in 1941 and renumbered 31 to 40. Built by Brush, their 250 horsepower motors had proved inadequate on the hilly routes. 123 dated from 1915. Over the years, many of the original bodies had either been rebuilt or considerably strengthened. Since 1957, the four-wheelers have been confined to peak-hour use only. By 1959, with the fleet strength at about 100 cars, only 6 of this class remained, and all these were scrapped at the end of the year. '33 had the distinctive London United design of broken staircase with halfway landing. From 1919, non-European cars have been painted silver, the red and black flashes being a later addition. The class were fitted with K4 controllers. After reaching a peak of some 40 cars during the war, the fleet of non-European trams had dwindled to a mere handful by 1959. The last equal-wheel native car was 31, and the last maximum tractions 106, 107 and 109. 37, seen here, was formerly number 117. The A, B, C and D group of routes serving the densely populated northeastern suburbs were replaced as from the 1st of February 1960. Eventually trolleybuses would take over the lines to Twist Street, Observatory and Yeovil, adding to the already extensive trolleybus network. The A, B, Cs and Ds started from the impressive three-track layout outside the City Hall. From here, a non-stop procession of cars could be observed arriving and departing, including those taking up service from the two depots. Although there had been experiments with through running, all routes terminated in the city centre, with separate loading points for the non-European services. Owing to the heavy usage, the rails demanded frequent attention, right up until the final closure. The three-track layout dated from 1915. Most services heading north used Eloff Street, which, despite protests from motorists, retained its attractive centre poles to the end. To ease congestion, non-European services and certain lunchtime expresses had used other adjacent trackage. This main thoroughfare had been relayed as late as 1952, and at the height of the rush hour there was always a car in sight. The A1 headed due north to terminate at Twist Street, a distance of some 2 miles. The Bs, however, continued to climb on a somewhat tortuous course, including no fewer than 8 right-angle bends, to Yeovil, the B1, and Observatory, the B2. Yeovil terminus. From here, trams had once continued on to Orange Grove and Norwood. The B2s branched off the Yeovil line. This route had a half-mile of single track at the outer end on the way to Observatory terminus at De La Rey Street, some 4 miles from the downtown. Judith Parle marked the furthest limit of the Cs and Ds. The route also served the world-famous International Rugby Ground, the final section being on single track. On the 31st of January 1961, Michael de Beer was given a free pass to travel over the remains of the system. It also allowed him to undertake some historic filming. Following the abandonments of early 1960, the last of the springboks had been withdrawn, together with some of the streamliners, whose all-metal bodies were increasingly suffering from corrosion. A few two-axle cars did remain on the property, including the last survivor of the 1907 batch of United Electric cars. Originally number 94, it had been demoted to a rail grinder or track grinder in 1952 and renumbered T2. The last of the class in passenger service had been withdrawn in 1958. In many ways, T2 typified the corporation's 115 four-wheel double-deckers. During the 20s, its body had either been strengthened or replaced, but it still retained its Brill 21E truck and a pair of 35 horsepower motors. The last 15 Springboks have been equipped with 50 horsepower motors. Hired specially for the occasion, T2 first headed northeast along the F line to Kensington, some 6 miles from City Hall. This was the middle of the 3 valley routes. It had started life as a much underused single track line, but had subsequently been upgraded with double track and was extended to its final terminus seen here as late as 1936. The 15 1907 cars enjoyed a somewhat checkered career, 3 ending up as single-deckers, 5 being transferred to native duties before the war and renumbered in the N200 series, whilst post-war they were gradually picked off for scrapping, leaving T2 as the sole survivor at the end of 1959. The controllers were DB1's Form B. In passenger days, T2 would have had protective red and white striped blinds on roller springs, which clipped into press studs on the panels of the upper deck. A delicate use of the handbrake and controller. Back at City Hall, the car negotiates the curve leading from Market Street into Symonds Street in order to gain access to the Newlands route. Although single-truck cars were now officially banned from venturing out to Newlands, owing to the parlous state of the permanent way, a dispensation had been made on this occasion. T2 was therefore probably the last two-axle tram to go out into the western suburbs. Interlaced track, the only example on the system, was used on this tightly angled bend in Friederdorp, movements round the blind corners being controlled by coloured light signals. Outbound alongside Brixton Cemetery. The Newlands route had opened in stages starting in 1909, and as part of the pre-war modernisation programme, the last sections of single track had been doubled in 1936. From the outset, all the countrified sections on the system had been laid with reserved track, the rails, poles and special work all being imported from the UK. Check rails were only used on extremely tight bends. Trundling slowly out to the end of the line on a length of single track opened as late as January 1950. on the way back to the city centre. This stretch of single-track reservation on Caroline Street was so close to the neighbouring gardens and walls there was hardly sufficient space to board the trams. It was used only by city-bound inbound cars. Those heading for Newlands used street track in an adjacent road. The long Newlands route was replaced by buses with effect from the 3rd of February 1961. Serving the western suburbs, the through cars displayed J1 and the various short workings J2, 3 and 4. By 1961 the Js were the exclusive preserve of the air bogies, of which some 60 remained out of a total fleet of 80. The loading point was between Market and President Streets, with the imposing City Hall and Cenotaph on the east side. Through cars operated every 18 minutes. For many years there had also been a relatively heavy non-European service to Western Native Township, which had its own central area loading point. The line had been abandoned in 1949. Non-European services were operated then as far as Short Market Street. By 1961 only a handful of these remained and now shared the same central area terminus. Note the streamliner taking up service from the depot. The air bogies had seats for 80 and standing room officially for a further 15, although this was frequently exceeded, especially on the non-European services. The majority had Brill 76E equal wheel bogies and 4 35 horsepower motors. Only the final 11 had brush bogies and more powerful 50 horsepower motors. All had been totally enclosed after the war. "183 was on the J4 non-European service. After leaving City Hall, the first 2.5 miles was on street track. From Friederdorp, the J's then traversed some 6 miles of different types of reservation, outbound alongside Brixton Cemetery. The J's served many of the oldest and poorest parts of Johannesburg, and occasionally the trams were subjected to sporadic outbursts of rioting. Skirting the huge native township, one of the Parkway crossovers. Following closure, the miles of reserve track which could have formed the basis of a light rail network was simply absorbed into road widening schemes. A non-European car reverses at Short Market Street, limit of the double track section. These cars had operated to this point since closure of the Western Native Township branch in 1949. 183 was one of the Bluebirds, which had sported the blue and grey colour scheme when built in 1923-4. The existing livery had been introduced in 1936. The final 3/4 of a mile of single track to Newlands terminus opened in January 1950, and it was something of a makeshift job, utilising rails from the former township branch and the overhead off the Melville and Parktown routes. 166 approaches the Midway passing loop. The end of the line, just short of the city limits at Long Road. Journey time for the 8.5-mile ride back to City Hall, 35 minutes, and the fare, 9p. The last 3 routes all served primarily residential neighbourhoods along the northeastern valleys. The O's ran via Kitchener Avenue to Besidenhout, the F's to Kensington via Roberts Avenue, and the G's to Malvern via Jewell Street. Base service on the valley routes required some 20 cars, supplemented by extras at peak hours. The ranks of the streamliners had continued to dwindle, but they still appeared in regular service throughout the early part of 1961. Despite various experiments, Johannesburg had dropped the idea of through running quite early. Like Birmingham and London, the trams terminated in the central area. Efforts were made to ease congestion and prevent delays. From 1935, the F's, G's and O's loaded from twin tracks in Loveday Street, opened as late as 1935. Inbound they travelled via Eloff Street and Market Street, passing through the former 3-track terminus of the northern routes. The crossovers were still used for depot journeys. Outbound cars used a single line along Commissioner Street. Action at the Eloff Street Commissioner Street junction. Leaving the city, all 3 lines ran along Main Street towards Jeppe and Belgravia. Convoys of cars would follow nose to tail during the rush hours, some on short workings of little more than 2 miles in length. The Malvern and Kensington routes both had 5 part-way crossovers. Both these cars are on peak hour only short workings. To reach the two most northern valleys, the O's and F's used a network of steeply graded one-way workings. The outbound O's had used this trackage in Janey Street since 1923. The outer limit of the Bez Valley line had opened in 1936, and it was the last route to benefit from track doubling completed in 1938. City-bound O's twisted and turned along Hans Street. The F's reached Roberts Avenue by means of Browning Street. Inbound, they dropped down into Belgravia along Corrie Street. '95 reverses on a partway G. Malvern Terminus, over 7 miles from Loveday Street. The G's traverse the longest length of straight track on the system, nearly 4 miles. Speeds, therefore, were quite high, as unlike the other lines, there were relatively few grades. The last day began quietly, with normal service operating on all 3 lines. Buses started to appear about midday, and following the Saturday lunch hour peak, the last tram in revenue service 159 left at about 1 p.m. The reign of the big red and cream cars was nearly over. To commemorate their passing, an incredible lineup of some 40 cars departed from Market Street. Special souvenir tickets were issued, and a certain number of trams left for the 3 main termini. The procession moved off at approximately 2 o'clock. Included was number 20 of 1906. At this point, the car was destined for the Tramway Museum at Crouch in England. Carrying civic dignitaries and transport officials, 20 led the convoy out to Malvern and back. Unfortunately, many of the trams were vandalised, and 20 only escaped serious damage by being driven flat out back to the depot. some of the streamliners have been brought virtually out of retirement. The power was eventually turned off at 5:30. Most of the fleet was sold for scrap at £80 a car, but a few did escape. Some were simply dumped or ended up as bungalows or sheds. No buyer having been found for the relatively new streamliners, the majority were broken up. Initially, a few did escape, but all have since been scrapped, except for number 214, preserved in the James Hall Museum of Transport. Perhaps the most remarkable rescue attempt was made by a former London Transport tram driver who purchased number 149, one of the 1920 group of air bogies, restored and painted it, and then placed it on a length of rail some 18 miles from the city. The car still remains there today. When the James Hall Transport Museum opened, number 20 was taken across town to be one of the star exhibits. Originally, the car had been intended to go to the Tramway Museum at Christchurch in England, but had been exchanged for number 60, another late survivor. The museum contains horse car number 8 of 1890, which ended its days in 1916 as a native trailer car. Number 20 represents the sturdy Springboks, which served the city for over 50 years. 200, the last of the air bogies, which ran for 30 years between 1931 and 1961. The museum also contains a number of buses and trolleybuses from other cities in South Africa, as well as Johannesburg. There is even a London Transport RT.